I debated if I even wanted to do this video, but everybody's talking about it, so I guess here we are. So, big nutrition news in the last couple of weeks, of course, is that the 2026 Dietary Guidelines for Americans were released. Now, the dietary guidelines are usually released every 5 years. The last time they were released was 2020. We had the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. I'm just going to give you a quick couple of thoughts on what do I think about the changes that were made? Are they really significant? And do they even apply to you as a tactical athlete? The biggest change, of course, are the protein recommendations that are in the new guidelines versus the previous ones. So in the 2020 guidelines, the recommended protein intake for somebody following a 2,400 calorie diet was only about 45 grams per day. Now, my athletes know that we are usually taking in about 45 grams of protein per meal at least. So this recommendation is definitely too low. So one of the positive things with the new recommendations, of course, is that they've increased the recommended amount of protein up to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. This is still pretty low, but keep in mind that the dietary guidelines for Americans are for the general person. Most of you guys are doing far more physical activity. You have a much more demanding physical job than most people that these guidelines are going to be beneficial for. My athletes are absolutely above the 1.6 gram per kilogram per day. And there are often times where we start to approach 2.4 grams per kilogram per day because we're following sports nutrition recommendations. One of the things that I am not too happy about is that everybody's making a big deal about how this pyramid is inverted and it's such a big change. But the reality is that we haven't used the food pyramid where the grains is on the bottom and you're getting 6 to 11 servings per day. We haven't used that pyramid in a decade. We've been using the MyPlate model. Now, the MyPlate model, if you remember it, it is a plate and it's divided into 4 sections on the plate, and then it has a little cup of dairy off to the side of it. So on this plate, you have about 25% of your plate covered in protein, 25% of your plate covered in grains. You have about 35% of your plate covered in vegetables, and you have the remaining 15% covered in fruit. And then, like I said, the little dairy cup is up at the top. Now, if you really look at the new pyramid that is out, it is exactly the same content. It's just been rearranged into a different picture format. One of the things that I liked about the MyPlate model is that you could look at it and say, okay, any given time I'm sitting down for a meal, this is generally what my plate should look like. Assuming, of course, that you're not using a 30-inch wide plate, right? Keep in mind that the standard plate is anywhere between about 9 and 10 inches wide. However, when you go to a restaurant, you're probably getting anywhere between a 12 to 16-inch plate. Now, in the 2020 guidelines, the recommendations for saturated fat were less than 10%. In the new 2026 guidelines, the recommendation for saturated fat is less than 10%. So we're emphasizing high protein foods, we're emphasizing butter, and we're emphasizing whole milk or whole milk dairy products. But yet we're still trying to keep our saturated fat under 10%. I think that's going to be really difficult for a lot of people. But it is important to remind you that saturated fat isn't necessarily the enemy. It's the amount of saturated fat that you're getting in comparison to your daily fiber intake and unsaturated fat. When you are getting a significant amount of saturated fat, this is one of the factors that can, yes, still drive up your LDL cholesterol levels, in addition to stress, in addition to alcohol intake, in addition to lack of sleep. The recommendations for added sugar intake didn't change. The recommendations for sodium intake didn't change. And when it comes to the starches or the grains, the previous guidelines stated that at least half of your starch intake should come from whole grains, versus the new guidelines do say that all of your intake should come from whole grains. So I think there's some positive things and there's some things that don't matter, and there's some not so great things within the dietary guideline. Another point that people like to make is how short the dietary guidelines are. It's only 12 pages long versus the 160 to 170 pages that it had previously been. So everybody's like, oh, it's so much easier to read. But the reality is that it's not actually shorter. So typically in the dietary guidelines, what they do is they put a lot of their scientific reasoning, a lot of their scientific research, they put a lot of data into the dietary guidelines. And that does make for a really long read. If you're a practitioner like myself, then this can be really helpful to get some context. But if you're just a person who's just wanting to learn how to eat healthier, this really isn't helpful, and it just creates a lot of noise. But the reality is that the document is actually longer. There is a 400-page addendum. If you go to the website and you continue to scroll through their slideshow, it will pop up at the bottom with all the scientific information. That also contains a much more detailed look at how you should be managing your nutrition through each stage of life. All things that were previously included in the dietary guidelines packet. It's just now been sparsed out, and so you have all these appendices that go along with it, which is perfectly fine because that's probably going to be more valuable to me than it is to you. So what does this mean for you as one of my athletes, or as a tactical athlete, or as somebody who's already high performing? Well, the reality is it doesn't mean jack shit, right? Because we don't follow typically the dietary guidelines to begin with. Usually we're following more sport-based recommendations, which are more appropriate for somebody who's training on a regular basis, who does a lot of physical activity throughout the day. And the reality is that even though we have these new guidelines, they're really only valuable if it's the basis for making institutional changes. We've had the dietary guidelines for a long time, and none of them have been horrible. The message has always been to eat more real food. That's not new either, even though people like to say that it is. One of the things that influences our nutrition and our eating habits more than just this policy is the environments in which we're exposed to. And so if we look at the food environment within our society, it is very poor. It is not conducive to eating a healthy lifestyle. We have a plethora of fast food restaurants. We have very few places where we can get really, truly fresh, unprocessed food, not to mention the cost of that. But that's kind of the trade-off that we pay when we're living in a society where we have less farmers, less labor force, and we have more thought workers. We live more sedentary lifestyles, and most of us aren't out there farming. I think one of the things that gets underemphasized a lot is the need for increased physical activity, setting up the environment, your own individual environment, because the reality is it's not just your nutrition that's promoting obesity and poor health, it's the lack of physical activity. In fact, lack of physical activity and poor cardiovascular fitness is even more of a risk factor for increased mortality than alcohol intake. So do I think the guidelines are going to change much? I don't know. I guess we'll see. I think that we as a society have been making a lot of positive changes on the individual level of being more health conscious, being more willing participants in our own healthcare. And that's really important. As we become more educated on taking care of ourselves, we are likely going to be making better choices. We're going to be doing things that are going to promote longevity, that are going to promote health. And so this is a big reason why when I'm coaching, we really focus on education and self-reliance. It's not just about me giving you meal plans. It's not just about me telling you what the recommendations are. It's not just about me holding your hand through the entire process. The goal when you're in the nutrition program is to actually help you become self-sufficient, to develop that discernment about what you should be doing based on your training program, based on your goals, without necessarily having to rely on a dietitian or a coach for the rest of your life to be able to do those things. So if you're interested in really learning how to apply higher level recommendations to create a high performance environment, a high performance program, then you can check out our coaching program. During the high energy and performance challenge, we are going to take a week and we are really going to dial in your nutrition to support your training needs so that you can kind of take your performance to that next level. If you feel like you've been struggling with energy, with recovery, and you really want to understand how to get the most bang for your buck through nutrition for your training sessions, then the challenge is definitely going to be something that you're going to want to look into. So over the course of 7 days, I'm going to teach you how to structure your peri-workout nutrition so that you can experience better endurance, more strength, more muscle growth, and better recovery. So if that's something that you want to implement this year, then check out the link below and let's get your program going.